Let's bring John McMullen into the conversation here and get some take from him on all the news of the day. But, John, we start off with Tony Romo, who retired today. He's going to go to CBS and become a broadcaster on the lead team there. We'll talk more about that later. But Pete and I were having an innocent lunch today, and Pete Thompson was asked a very simple question. Who's better, McNabb or Romo? They're the two basically 2000 years, that era quarterbacks for the two franchises that reside in the same division. So I thought it was an interesting question to kind of pontificate on. But as you can imagine, we're getting a lightning rod of reaction here.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, it's not even that close. I think Donovan is a borderline Hall of Fame quarterback, and I think Tony was just a really, really good quarterback, and he's not in that stratosphere. Hey, I've been a defender of Tony Romo. I think he's underrated as a whole overall, but you're talking about a consistency with Donovan McNabb in the 5 NFC championship games, the Super Bowl. If he got one, he would be a Hall of Famer. No doubt, no brainer. He'd be in the Hall of Fame. I don't even think it's worth arguing. I don't think it's that close. And that's not an insult to Tony Romo. It's just where he is in the game, and the fact that he was, as I said, he was a really good quarterback, but he wasn't a top-tier quarterback.
Yeah, I say the same thing. I like Romo. I thought he was underappreciated because of the market that we're in, that people always hated on him. But if you say the two guys are similar, the playoff success of McNabb, which is mediocre, 9-7, against the playoff success of
the number alone, the 16 playoff games, that's not mediocre.
And that's a good point.
In a lot of ways, people, and I say the same thing with Andy Reid, because his obviously playoff record is mediocre, but the number of playoff games and the number of playoffs he's made tell you about the consistency of the job he does each and every year. Same thing with Donovan McNabb. That's something to it. It's hard to get to the playoffs in this league. I think sometimes people do lean on the crutch of Super Bowls and say that's the be-all, end-all, and forget there are other parts to it. So I don't just look at playoff participation, playoff games, playoff wins. But when you're there 16 times, that's not a fluke. That means you're really, really, really good.
I think that's well stated, is that when you just say a quarterback and you so cavalierly just kind of say 16, yeah, there's not a lot of quarterbacks that are playing 16 playoff games in their career. Tony Romo, who, as you just chronicled, is very good, only appeared in 6 playoff games ever over the entire status of his career. It's not like he only played 7 years and made the playoff 6 times. He was in the league for, how many years did Romo play? He was drafted in what year?
There were 14 seasons for Romo, 13 for McNabb.
Okay, so he didn't start all those years, but he played very early in his career and only made the playoffs and played in 6 playoff games, and he didn't win one. He was 0 for a while. He didn't win one till later on in the career. I think that speaks volumes, as you said. The amount of times that McNabb was able to get to the playoffs, I think is just a clear indication. Because yes, McNabb had good defenses, but I think you could make an argument that Romo had more talent to work with on the offensive side of the ball.
At times he did, but I think you look at it, they both had such long careers. They both went through stretches where they had ups and downs. I heard Pete with the offensive lines. At one point, Donovan had John Runyon, Trey Thomas. He had a very good offensive line. So, but he never had a ton of playmakers around him. Then he got Terrell Owens and Brian Westbrook at once. So that helped for a short period of time. But I kind of chuckled off air when someone said people didn't game plan for Donovan McNabb. He was, for many, many years, he was the only thing you had to game plan for the Philadelphia Eagles offense. And I think it was Josh who chimed in. He is a tremendously unique quarterback. And if you're a stats guy, look, stats, I hate to break it to people, they're not all that important in NFL football. He's not the most accurate guy in the world. But if you talk to opposing defensive coordinators, he was so difficult to deal with. As far as we see it all the time with quarterbacks now, we talk about Aaron Rodgers and extending plays. That's the type of quarterback he was. I'm not saying he's that good, so don't jump down my throat, but he's so difficult to deal with because of his ability to extend plays, how strong he was to sort of shake off the rush. And anytime you have a dual threat, and it's not about running the football. It's not about necessarily having 700-800 yards rushing like Russell Wilson used to do. It's about extending the play and putting stress on defenses. And in the prime of his career, nobody did that better than Donovan McNabb.
John, how about this when you put the two guys together and you look at the way their numbers balance out? Brad Johnson, for example, has a Super Bowl ring. He played in 15 playoff games with 4 different teams. Romo's numbers of not getting to the postseason a lot, that's an indictment against him.
Yeah, it is, and he's never played in an NFC Championship game. So that's an indictment as well. Again, it's not the be-all, end-all because there are 52 other guys. You mentioned Brad Johnson, the guy who I covered up close. I think he's tremendously underrated as far as winning football games. But people look at him and don't see the skill set. Tony, on the other hand, was a tremendous regular season quarterback.
Yep.
And when the stakes got bigger, it didn't necessarily go that well. And that's why I rate him where I rate him, and that's as a very, very good quarterback. But I don't put him near the Hall of Fame. I think people going down that route are silly. He's not even in the ballpark. And for a guy like McNabb, who, by the way, I also don't think is ultimately going to make the Hall of Fame, he's not even at that level.
By the way, good fodder, good reaction from our listeners. Keep them coming at 973 ESPN. You can vote on which quarterback you think is better. And by the way, the listeners are kind of speaking right now. McNabb, the last time we checked anyway, was kind of running away in a landslide there. So I have some faith in humanity has been restored that some people understand football out there. All right, John, you wrote about it at 973 ESPN. Adam Schefter reported it earlier this afternoon. The Eagles have made a significant move on the defensive side of the ball to help with the defense here, losing Benny Logan, and they added defensive tackle today. Talk a little bit about Timmy Jernigan, who's going to come over from Baltimore, and the move that Howie Roseman pulled off here.
Yeah, this is a big pickup, and this is going to be the starter at defensive tackle opposite Fletcher Cox. So he is going to be the replacement for Benny Logan. He's a former second-round pick. He was drafted in Joe Douglas's last year when he in Baltimore before he moved to Chicago. So he's very familiar with him. And I think he's a better fit for what Jim Schwartz likes because he's sort of a penetrating player as opposed to just a run stuffer like Benny was. So I think this is an example of a very good trade, and probably Joe Douglas had a heavy hand in it, and it's the type of player that projects well into Jim Schwartz's defense. And when you're a personnel guy in this league, that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to get players that the coaches want, and I think Jim Schwartz is going to be very, very happy with Timmy Jernigan.
And you get a starting level player, John. Did they give up a lot in your estimation? They moved down in the third round, 20 picks or something like that. Did they have to give up a lot to get a starter?
No, they didn't. They moved down 25 spots, so they're moving from 74 to 99, which is a compensatory pick, so it's at the end of the third round. But when you pick up a starting level player and you still have a third round pick, granted much later in the round, I think that's tremendous value. And it was, from the Eagles standpoint, it makes a lot of sense because we talked about when Benny left, there was the fodder that Bo Allen was going to be a starter, and he's just not a starting level player. He's a nice backup. He's a nice fill-in guy. He probably should be playing 15 to 20 snaps a game, and that's it. So they improved themselves significantly, and from Baltimore standpoint, they had younger bodies they wanted to look at. So I think it works out for both sides.
John McMullen with us here on the Sports Bash on 97.3 ESPN as we break down a little bit of Eagles football and, of course, the big news today about Tony Romo.
Yeah, go ahead. What?
Tony, are we there?
Yeah, we're here. There? We're here. We're here on the Sports Bash on 97.3 ESPN. So, John, to talk about the Eagles move that they made today, the fact that it was done with Baltimore in mind, does that have something to do with Joe Douglas and Joe Douglas's connection back to that franchise?
Yeah, I think it's got a huge bearing on it. And as I said, that was his last year when Jernigan was drafted in the second round. That was Joe's last year in Baltimore. And then he went to Chicago for the year, and then he ended up as the head of the Eagles personnel department. So he's very, very familiar with them. He was in the conversation when they drafted him. So, yeah, that had a big impact on the Eagles making this move, and it's a player he liked very much back in 2014.
All right, as Pete started to talk about there, Romo did retire. He's going to go to CBS now, but he has an opportunity to get out of that, right? He can get an offer. So how does the whole retiring and having that clause in there, how does that, sit with the fact that Romo is officially retired?
Well, he's from the Cowboys' standpoint, the key part was they did release him today. With a post-June 1st designation. So if he does decide to get to come back, and I was texting with an NFL guy today, he's going to be the first number on everybody's speed dial if there's an injury, similar to what happened with Teddy Bridgewater last season. If something happens somewhere else in this league and there's an injury to a starting quarterback, first number you're calling is Tony Romo. You would have to think from CBS's perspective, the fact they're giving him such a high-profile position, they have some assurances that he's not going to walk away from it. There's no guarantee of that. I haven't seen that anywhere, but I couldn't imagine they would give him the spot they're giving him if they thought he was going to go back to the NFL. And from Jerry Jones's perspective, I think he's the happiest guy in the world because that's the one place where if Dak Prescott gets injured, I think there could be a wink there. And Jerry gives him a call and says, "Come on back."
Right? Is this him not wanting to? Is this him not wanting to just learn another offense, go someplace else? Because obviously Texans, Broncos, teams that need quarterbacks, it could be playoff level teams. Why no interest from him to go there? It would seem that, hey, you know what? I had the CBS offer. I don't want to learn another offense, and if I retire, something happens, I can go back to Dallas.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more than the offense. It's got to do with the health issues, and I think it finally settled in on him and said, you go back to Thanksgiving of 2015. In 5 games, he's broken his clavicle twice, and he's had back surgery with a back injury. So I always looked at this as he's going to be 37 later this month. And to assume he was going to go to Houston or Denver and play 16 games and be fully healthy was probably folly. It really was, considering what he's been through and how many issues he's had. So I think he got this great gig. He's going to be the number one NFL broadcasting team on CBS, replacing Phil Simms. He's also going to get to do golf, which he loves. And I just thought he probably said, this is a great gig. I'm going to be able to do this for years and years and years in theory. And he just said, it's time. And I don't blame him because that's the decision I think he should have made because of his health issues.
If you're Phil Simms today, John, do you stay with the network or do you hit the golf course on a more regular basis?
Well, I mean, I stay with the network, but that's an ego thing. From Phil's perspective, I don't expect him to. Maybe if they move him to the studio show, you can kind of spin it because Tony Gonzalez is leaving and say it's not a demotion. But he's been doing that for so long. And by the way, I think it's kind of an insult to the guys who do it. to assume Tony's going to be able to step in there and be the number one team and be great at it. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't, but it's more difficult than people think it is.
Right.
And we'll see how he shakes out. But from an ego standpoint, I'd be hurt if I were Phil Simms. From a logic standpoint, it's still a great gig if he's on the second team or third team. Or the studio show. So we'll see how that part of it shakes out.
All right. So the news today, Timmy Jernigan, the Eagles make a deal with the Ravens and get themselves a starting defensive tackle there. We'll have more on that a little bit later on as well. You can read about it at 973ESPN.com, how he'll fit in with this Jim Schwartz defense. And John McMullen, of course, with our NFL news and notes right here on the Sports Bash 97.3 ESPN. We're getting close to the countdown to the draft here, John, and we'll start to focus in a little bit more on pick number 14. But until then, we bid you adieu.
Hey, thank you, guys.